The sky over the mid-Atlantic was the color of beaten metal when the Avenger broke through the clouds. The pilot could feel the cold rising from the water below, a silent reminder that this stretch of ocean, thousands of miles from home, had swallowed entire convoys whole. Ahead of him, a dark shape slipped beneath the waves, a German U-boat beginning its desperate crash dive. He had no more than 90 seconds. One wrong calculation, and either the submarine would escape or the blast would take his own aircraft. The Avenger dropped lower its engine, straining against the wind. Spray burst upward as the U-boat vanished into its final refuge. The pilot armed his depth charges and committed to a line of attack that offered no second chances. Moments later, two columns of white water erupted like pillars, and the submarine's stern lurched upward in a shudder that could be seen even from the air. In that instant, history shifted, because this strike did not come from a mighty fleet carrier. It came from USS Bogue, a small escort carrier the Navy once dismissed as impractical, too slow, and too vulnerable for real war. So how did these so-called baby flattops, built on merchant hulls and sent into the storm, become the weapon that changed the Battle of the Atlantic and turned U-boats from hunters into hunted? The ocean had been quietly tilting toward disaster long before USS Bogue ever launched her first aircraft. By early 1943, the North Atlantic had become a battleground, defined not by grand fleets, but by exhaustion of crews of merchant ships and of nations depending on a fragile lifeline of supplies. At the center of this crisis stood the German U-boat fleet, operating with a confidence earned through years of uninterrupted success. In March alone, U-boats sent 82 Allied vessels to the bottom, nearly 500,000 tons of food, fuel, and war material swallowed by the sea. Convoys crossed the ocean, knowing that somewhere in the dark still predators waited. The geography made it worse. Land-based aircraft from Newfoundland and Northern Ireland could shield convoys near the coasts, but between them stretched almost 700 miles of open ocean, the mid-Atlantic Gap, a killing ground sailors called the Black Pit. There the U-boat held every advantage. They surfaced freely at night to charge batteries, coordinated wolfpack attacks, and slipped beneath the waves before escorts could react. For a moment, German Admiral Karl Dönitz came close to severing the artery feeding Britain's survival. Amid this crisis, the United States Navy struggled with its own convictions. Its carrier doctrine, shaped over decades, emphasized speed, striking power, and armored decks. Fleet carriers, fast, spacious, and bristling with aircraft, were the embodiment of modern naval warfare. Against that backdrop, the proposed escort carriers seemed almost insulting, slow merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on top, carrying barely 24 planes armed lightly, and moving at a pace any enemy cruiser could overtake. Admirals labeled them impractical, even dangerous. Crews joked that the CVE designation stood for Combustible Vulnerable Expendable. Yet President Franklin Roosevelt saw what others could not. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a contest of fleet carriers trading blows across vast distances. It was a war of endurance. Ships were being lost, not in great clashes, but one by one caught by U-boats beneath churning gray seas. What mattered was not speed, but presence, an aircraft in the sky when a submarine dared to surface. In December 1940, Roosevelt overruled his own navy, ordering an emergency program to convert merchant ships into escort carriers, capable of delivering continuous air coverage where it mattered most. The first result, USS Long Island, was little more than a proof of concept, a cargo ship reborn as a fragile flight deck with no armor and limited speed. But she worked. and so did the next and the next. Then came USS Bogue, a sturdier purpose-modified merchant hull carrying Wildcats and Avengers of Composite Squadron 9. When she first entered the Atlantic in early 1943, she was assigned to protect convoys crossing the mid-Atlantic Gap. Her aircraft flew endless patrols, searching for periscopes and silhouettes. But each time they found a U-boat, it slipped underwater long before they could strike. Through 3 complete crossings, USS Bogue sank nothing. Critics in Washington pointed to the results as proof that escort carriers were a failed experiment. But the ocean was about to change, and with it, so would the war. The turning point came not from a new ship or a new weapon, but from a new way of thinking. Admiral Ernest King, watching the worsening crisis, recognized that the traditional defensive posture was failing. Tying escort carriers like USS Bogue to convoys meant that the initiative always belonged to the U-boats. The submarines could wait, choose the moment, and strike from the shadows. To defeat them, the Navy had to reverse the psychology of the Atlantic War. It had to hunt. In the spring of 1943, King adopted the British concept of hunter-killer groups, self-contained task forces built around an escort carrier and a screen of destroyers, freed from convoy duty and guided by intelligence from HFDF intercepts and decoded Enigma traffic. Their mission was simple: find German submarines in the open ocean and destroy them before they ever reached a convoy. USS Bogue became the nucleus of the first American group. When she sailed from Norfolk in April 1943 with 4 destroyers at her side, she carried a new sense of purpose. For the first time, the small carrier was not waiting for the enemy to appear. She was going looking for them. The transformation was immediate. On May 21st, as Bogue escorted convoy on 184, her radio operators detected the distinctive signals of a gathering wolf pack. Lieutenant Commander William Drain launched his Avengers into the growing dusk, following the faint pulse of German transmissions. The next day, they found U-231 on the surface, charging her batteries. Depth charges smashed her radio masts and forced her to abandon her patrol altogether. Hours later came the breakthrough that justified the entire escort carrier program. Multiple aircraft from Composite Squadron 9 spotted different submarines shadowing the convoy. One of them was U-569 desperately crash diving. In a single precise run, Drain's Avenger dropped its charges just yards behind the conning tower. The twin eruptions that followed sealed the submarine's fate. Her crew abandoned ship and the Atlantic claimed her in minutes. It was the first U-boat sunk by aircraft launched from a U.S. escort carrier, and its symbolic weight was immense. The hunters had been hunted. Success bred confidence. With convoy on 184 delivered safely, USS Bogue received new orders, no more escort duty. She was now a pure hunter-killer platform, guided by intelligence. Her aircraft swept vast sectors of the mid-Atlantic Gap, turning the once feared Black Pit into a killing ground for submarines. In June, Avengers caught U-217 refueling from a Milk Co. tender. Both submarines were driven under, and U-217 was lost with all hands. A week later, U-118 met the same fate. In July, U-527 and U-603 were destroyed in separate but equally relentless attacks. By the end of 1943, USS Bogue and her escorts had sunk 11 German U-boats, more than any other American escort carrier group. Not a single convoy under her protection lost a ship. And for the submarine crews who once dominated the Atlantic, the ocean now felt crowded, not with prey, but with aircraft engines humming somewhere beyond the clouds. The initiative had shifted. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a defensive struggle. It had become a pursuit. Victory at sea rarely comes from a single breakthrough. It comes from pressure applied day after day, ship after ship, until the enemy bends under a weight he can no longer carry. In the summer of 1943, that pressure came from numbers. The Allied air gap had narrowed, and hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers pushed deeper into the mid-Atlantic gap, stripping the U-boat arm of its most precious resource, freedom to operate. But the transformation of the war required more than tactics. It demanded industry. On the American West Coast, shipbuilder Henry Kaiser was reshaping naval construction through a philosophy that defied tradition. Instead of treating ships as handcrafted masterpieces, he treated them as manufactured products, assembled from prefabricated sections, welded by crews working around the clock. Many of them women who had never set foot in a shipyard before the war. Out of this industrial momentum came the Casablanca-class escort carriers, a fleet of 50 ships built in a single year, one carrier every 7.3 days. It was quantity as a weapon, and it mattered. As the carriers multiplied, the ocean tightened around the German submarine fleet. The psychological toll was swift and unforgiving. U-boats that once surfaced confidently at night now found themselves illuminated by radar-equipped Avengers. Crash diving once the surest escape became a gamble when new acoustic torpedoes homed in on the roar of a submarine's propellers. Crews spent days submerged rationing air, fighting carbon dioxide poisoning, and listening to distant propellers circling above. Patrols that once returned with multiple sinkings now came home empty-handed. Veteran commanders requested transfers. New recruits required psychological conditioning before ever stepping aboard. Amid this collapse came one of the most extraordinary moments of the Battle of the Atlantic, the capture of U-505 in June 1944. After 8 hours of relentless pursuit, the submarine surfaced in panic. Her crew abandoned ship, expecting the Americans to sink her. Instead, a boarding party from the escort carrier, USS Guadalcanal, climbed aboard the flooding vessel, racing against the scuttling charges that could detonate at any moment. They saved the submarine, intact, Enigma, machine codebooks, charts, and even acoustic torpedoes. It was the first enemy ship seized on the high seas by the US Navy since the War of 1812, and the intelligence windfall Tapati remained secret for the rest of the war. Yet, the cost of the campaign remained real. Escort carriers were still merchant hulls at heart, slow, unarmored, and vulnerable. In November 1943, USS Liscome was torn apart by a Japanese submarine's torpedo, taking 644 men with her in minutes. Off Samar in October 1944, the baby Flattops of Taffy 3 faced Japanese battleships in a desperate fight to protect the invasion forces at Leyte. Gambier Bay was pounded into the sea. St. Lo was struck by one of the first organized kamikaze attacks. The survivors carried those moments for the rest of their lives. And still, the mission continued. By the end of 1944, the once dominant U-boat fleet was a shadow cut down by aircraft, by radar, by code breaking, and overwhelmingly by the presence of escort carriers in places where submarines had once roamed freely. The hunters had become the hunted, and the cost had been paid in full by men on both sides of the waterline. The success of the escort carriers did more than win battles at sea. It challenged the very structure of military thinking. For the United States, the rise of these baby Flattops exposed a long-standing tension between traditional naval doctrine and wartime necessity. Senior admirals had dismissed them as liabilities, convinced that speed and armor defined naval power. But the war revealed a different truth. In the vastness of the Atlantic presence mattered more than prestige. What changed the Battle of the Atlantic was not a handful of powerful ships. It was the persistence of many modest ones. President Franklin Roosevelt, often criticized for interfering in military affairs, emerged vindicated. He had insisted that the battle would be won not by elite formations, but by forces that could remain on stations on day after day until the U-boat threat collapsed. His decision to push the escort carrier program over the objections of his own navy demonstrated a strategic clarity that only years later would be fully appreciated. Post-war planners embraced the lesson. New carrier classes, such as the Commencement Bay design, were conceived from the outset as escort platforms, proving the Navy had absorbed the shift in thinking. Across the ocean, Admiral Karl Dönitz saw the consequences more sharply than anyone. German records and later memoirs reveal his belief that the appearance of American hunter-killer groups marked an existential threat to the submarine fleet. Surfacing became a risk. Battery charging became a torment. Navigation without star sights became guesswork. Even the revolutionary Type 51 submarines, faster underwater than most Allied escorts, arrived too late, built in too few numbers and crippled by bombing and shortages. The ocean, once an ally to the U-boats, had become hostile. Among the allies, the effect was equally profound. The Royal Navy, which had pioneered the escort carrier concept, found its ideas amplified by American industrial strength. British strategists noted that by 1944, the U-boat campaign had lost both its tactical advantage and its psychological mystique. Air coverage was constant. Wolf packs could no longer mass undetected. The invisible weapon of the First World War had been rendered visible and vulnerable. For many Americans watching the war from home, the message was clear. The tools of victory were not always the ones that dazzled. Sometimes they were the tools that endured. The escort carrier, underestimated in every way except the one that mattered, had proven that adaptability, not orthodoxy, is the lifeblood of military success. In the end, the legacy of the escort carriers is not written in tonnage sunk or sorties flown, though those numbers tell an impressive story. It is written in something quieter, something that lives between the lines of naval history. These ships, dismissed at first as makeshift, vulnerable, even expendable, proved that war is shaped as much by adaptability as by power. They closed the mid-Atlantic gap, broke the momentum of the U-boat campaign, and helped secure the supply lines that kept Britain alive. Without them, the Battle of the Atlantic might have stretched on into uncertainty, testing the fortitude of nations already stretched thin. Yet their triumph carried a strange irony. They won so decisively that their very purpose vanished. After 1945, no nation needed to convert merchant hulls into carriers again. The threat they were built to defeat had been erased. One by one, the ships were retired, scrapped, or transferred abroad. Not a single wartime escort carrier survives as a museum today. Their decks, once alive with the roar of wildcats and avengers, exist now only in photographs and in the memories of the men who served on them. Still, their lessons endure. They remind us that strategy is not only about strength, but about foresight. That innovation can come from unlikely places. That in war, the tools that matter most are often the ones capable of being built quickly, deployed widely, and used relentlessly. And they remind us that courage does not require armor plate.